Okay, folks, this is going to be quite the long review because there was a lot to say and a lot online about it. So we're going to begin. 1984, we're doing another David Lynch film. I'm going through his earlier movies. Dune. This is a Stanislaus County rental copy. And this is a DVD release from 1998. So it is an out-of-print release. This movie was panned by critics and was a box office failure. Yeah, so let's talk about this movie. 137-minute runtime. Is that right? 2 hours and 17 minutes. You do the math. So I tried to get my wife to watch this movie with me. As you will know, she's not here. I'm by myself. She did not get into this film and walked out of it. I was hoping that Kyle MacLachlan would draw her in because we love him in other Lynch projects like Twin Peaks and The Return. But it's a sci-fi movie and she found it quite boring. So I have mixed feelings. On one point, I agree with a lot of what the critics had to say. It's kind of confusing at times and hard for me to follow, but visually I loved the film. So this movie had a $40 million budget and bombed at the box office, making only about $30.9 million between US and Canada, and it was planned to be the next Star Wars. It was supposed to be huge. There was toys. The advertising campaign for this movie was huge. It was filmed in Mexico for the budget to stretch a little bit further. Interestingly enough, I got notes on another film that I need to review. I reviewed Total Recall recently. In my notes, I haven't filmed that review yet, but it was filmed at the same studio in Mexico City, a place called Churubusco Studios. And it was a gargantuan production, over 20,000 extras. Let me look back here. 16 sound stages, 80 sets. It was a big budget film. It's a David Lynch adaptation of the 1965 Frank Herbert best-selling novel. And it's just, I think it's a misunderstood film because visually the sets, the way that he filmed it. And I felt the same way when I watched The Elephant Man. When I watched The Elephant Man, the David Lynch directed film, I felt like I was watching a movie from the late 50s or early 60s. It was black and white. Even though it was filmed in 1980, it felt like it was a movie that was filmed potentially 20 years earlier. This film had a similar vibe. The color and the lighting and a lot of the interior scenes and the way they did everything, not so much the exterior desert scenes, but a lot of the interior set scenes and the way they captured everything. I felt like I was watching a movie from color films of the late 60s, maybe even late 50s, early 60s. It just felt like visually the film stock, the way they did the cinematography, it felt like a movie that was filmed at a different point in time than 1984 when it came out, if that makes sense. But I see many elements of David Lynch and his kind of trademarks that he would become known for. You see electricity flashes, smoke, the sound effects, lots of things going on that are just, to me, now that I'm going through his films, are hallmarks of David Lynch's visionary style. And then I can see other people, like, to me, I could see maybe Wes Anderson being influenced by the way some of this film is, with the background narration, the maps of the planets, with the letter style appearing to kind of designate it. It kind of had a Wes Anderson vibe. So I wonder if Wes Anderson was kind of influenced by this Lynch style for this particular film. It had a soundtrack by Toto, the late 70s, early 80s rock band, and Brian Eno was also in on the soundtrack. It took a long time to get this film made. Movie plans for this date all the way back to 1971. At one point, it was going to be a big budget film directed by David Lean, that you know for huge epics like Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, Bridge Over the River Kwai, if I'm not mistaken. and then it went to Ridley Scott, and he was working on a screenplay, and he felt that this movie should really be 3 films. Their screenplay was massive. He was really working on this film with H.R. Geiger, who we love in Alien, as early as 1979. And then he ended up leaving the project and going to direct Blade Runner instead. So then it was pitched to Lynch, and he fell in love with it after he read the book. And so then he took on the film, and it was made through most of 1983 and would be released in 1984. So yes, it was very hard to follow at times. The things that the critics did not like, I loved. I loved the set design. I loved the practical effects, and albeit they are very dated because we're used to the CGI. I have not seen the new films, by the way. I love that style of cinema and that era of cinema. It just has a realism and more personal touch that I like. And all of David Lynch's touches and his vision being brought to it, I just really enjoyed the film. Rotten Tomato critic average, 36%, which I think is very unfair. The audience average is much higher, and I'm kind of more on all lines with them, maybe even a little bit higher. Audience member average is 65%, with over 50K people submitting their reviews. IMDb 6.3 out of 10, and at first I was going to be in the 3s, 3 out of 5 range, but then as the film wore on, I overall liked how the film wrapped up, and I felt happy with it. And I loved the cinematography, and I loved the casting, and I loved the costuming, and I loved the set design. There were so many things about this film that I really enjoyed. I am going to give it a final review of 4 out of 5. I think it is an underrated classic. There were many versions of this film that I read about. So there was originally a 4-hour rough cut of this film, and then it got brought down to 3 hours. Ultimately, we get the theatrical version, which is the only release that David Lynch was happy with, that he put his seal of approval on, and that is the version that we see here on this DVD. There is a German release that shows some of the other versions. So in the 80s, it was split up into 2 nights of television viewing, and that is a 186-minute version. David Lynch disavowed any of those other releases, having his name be taken off the listings of directorialship or the name changed to something else. Whenever he would be approached to talk about it, he refused to talk about it in interviews. A lot of people had asked him to maybe release a longer director's cut, and he said no. Up until 2020, he was interviewed and said that maybe he would revisit it. This movie was planned to be, again, another Star Wars franchise type of big box trilogy type of movie. At least 2 films were planned. Kyle MacLachlan had signed on for 2 films. When it was a box office failure, Lynch shelved his screenplay that he was working on and refused to talk about it ever again. So again, I like it. I think it's a great picture, and it's worth watching. I don't know why people didn't enjoy it at the time. I would have loved to see another part 2 of this movie and have that whole universe, because I thought it was just beautifully filmed, and I really liked the story. And I tried to get into the new ones. I'll maybe have to revisit it and talk about those. I watched the first one. I tried to, and I got about 5 minutes in and I started losing interest. So maybe in the future I will talk about the newer ones, because we have 2 new versions of this film. And I believe that movie has been commercially successful, and they're even planning a 3rd film, if I'm not mistaken. So thanks for watching. We'll review another David Lynch film shortly. We'll see you next time.